Hello everyone, good evening. As we all know that nutrition management of various clinical conditions should not be limited only to the dietary aspect of it, but it involves a multidisciplinary aspect. And we as practicing dietitians and students should be aware about the medical management, various tests, various investigations, and various signs and symptoms and the significance of it in the management of the disorder. Keeping in mind the Indian Dietetic Association Mumbai chapter has started the initiative of NutriBulletin. NutriBulletin is an evidence-based talk on medical nutrition therapy of clinical conditions from the experts. So for each episode or for each clinical conditions, we have a panel of experts which involves doctors, various health experts who give their inputs on various aspects of management, such as the medical aspect or the nutrition aspect of the management of the disease. As the first topic, we have selected hypothyroidism in clinical practice. And to address hypothyroidism, here have taken two perspectives, that is the medical management of hypothyroidism and the nutrition management of hypothyroidism. As you all remember, we had released two videos. The first one was on the medical management of thyroid diseases, and the second one was nutrition management of thyroid diseases. And you must believe, and you will completely agree with me, that the videos or the content of the videos and the topics were covered so extensively that you can really not find such topics anywhere. So we had also asked you to write down your questions and queries in on our YouTube channels of Indian Dietetic Association Mumbai chapter. So here we begin our first topic, that is thyroid disease in clinical practice question answer session. So let me introduce you to our three speakers, Dr. Tejal Lathia. Yeah. So she's DM endocrinology. She's a gold medalist. She's a faculty speaker at numerous conferences. She has various publications and posters at AAC, ADA, and IDF. And she's been part of the latest telethyroidology in thyroid research and practice. She's authored chapters, book chapters in various topics. She's a reviewer of several journals. She's a consultant for health technology companies. Special interest she has in GDM, PCOS, and osteoporosis. Our second speaker, who has also addressed the medical management, is Dr. Gayatri Gharnikar. She is DM endocrinology from Hinduja Hospital, and she practices in Kalyan and Dombivli. She also has special interest in thyroid disorders. Next, please. The nutrition management of thyroid disorders was covered by Dr. Neeti Desai. She's a senior consultant nutritionist. She practices in South Mumbai, attached to Kambala Hill Hospitals for 17 years. She's Secretary Association of Diabetes Educators, co-editors of IDA's Clinical Dietetic Manual 2018, Joint Treasurer IDA Mumbai chapter. She also writes regular column in health and nutrition for 18 years, and she is official nutritionist for Femina Miss India 2008. So without wasting much time, we will start our question and answer session. Okay. So the first question I would like to ask is to Dr. Gayatri, and that is, what is the difference between T3, T4 and free T3 and T4, and what is their significance? Also, how frequently thyroid patients should monitor their TFTs, and should they be taking medication on the day they do their test?
Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Anagha, for giving us this opportunity. Good evening to everyone. Just would like to make a small correction. I have done DNB and endocrinology, not DM. Okay, so coming to the question, so the total T3 and total T4, basically T3 and T4 are thyroid gland hormones which are circulated in the blood to all the body parts or the body organs. So they are complexed with blood proteins in the blood, predominantly a protein called as thyroid binding globulin. So total T3 and total T4 is hello.
Yes.
Okay. So total T3 and total T4 are nothing but complexes of active thyroid hormones and their binding proteins. Okay, and free T3, free T4 are the actual active hormones. So for most of the patients with common variety hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, doing a total T3, total T4 and TSH is more than enough for diagnosis as well as for monitoring. But in certain specific situations like pregnancy, or in the patients with liver dysfunction, or in patients with malabsorption, it is better if we ask for a free T3 and free T4. Also in patients who have pituitary diseases which lead to thyroid dysfunction, TSH is unreliable marker in such patients. So that's why in such patients free T3, free T4 are better than total T3, total T4. Coming to monitoring of the thyroid function test, so basically T4 has a long half-life of around 7 days. So whenever we start levothyroxine for a patient with hypothyroidism, or when we change the dose, we want to look at the effect of the changed dose or the dose that we have started. So around 6 weeks, it takes around 6 weeks for the thyroid axis to achieve equilibrium. So first test that we order is generally at that time, around 6 weeks. And once we find the exact dose of the patient or the accurate requirement of the patient, patients can do less frequent monitoring, like once in 3 to 6 months, but it should be in consultation with their treating endocrinologist. In certain situations like pregnancy, we would like to go for more frequent monitoring, like for earlier part of the pregnancy, like first maybe 20 weeks or so, every 4 weeks if we can monitor, it is better to accurately adjust the dose. And subsequently in the later half of the pregnancy, little less frequent monitoring can also be done, but it should be individualized and it should be only strictly in consultation with the treating endocrinologist. And whether to take medication on the day of test or no. So what happens is, if we are going to ask for total T3, total T4, it does not matter whether the patient takes medicine or doesn't take. And
Okay.
coming to free T3 and free T4 testing, if the patient has taken medication and has given blood sample immediately after that, it may lead to slight increase in the free T4 levels for some time. So it is better to tell the patients to avoid taking medication before giving their blood samples. Okay, because the remembering the difference between total T3 and free T3 will be very difficult. So it is better that we tell patients to not to take medication before giving blood sample. They once they have given the blood samples for thyroid testing, they can come back home and take their levothyroxine tablets.
In this connection,
Okay.
Dr. Gayatri, there's a question that should they be doing all 3 parameters every time, or would it be okay for them to check only TSH as suggested by some of the doctors sometimes?
Yes, so for most of the patients, once they have been diagnosed properly, and once we are doing the test only to see to it that their levothyroxine dose is proper, we can also do away with only TSH. Initial part of the disease, initial part of the diagnosis, it is better that we do total, I mean
All
T3,
3.
T4 and
All 3. Okay. So that's something to remember.
And can I just interrupt? Just one point that
yes.
only in
Yeah.
pituitary diseases we prefer to do the T3 and the T4 is relevant. So sometimes if a doctor is asking only for the free T3, free T4 or the total T3, T4, then pituitary diseases, then specifically look at the thyroid hormones. We don't look at the TSH.
Okay, that's great.
Yes.
So then that's something to even let the doctor decide which test to be performed. Depending on what the doctor says, we should go for the testing. That's
Right.
very good. Our next question is for Dr. Tejal. Does the requirement of thyroid medication increase during pregnancy as it progresses? What can you do if you miss a dose, you forget to take your medication? And does the role of hypo or hyperthyroidism have any role to play in hyperlactation?
Okay, so the first, I'll attempt the first part of the question of whether in pregnancy, as the pregnancy progresses, the dose increases or not. So what we usually find is that in those people who already have a thyroid problem, and when women get pregnant, in the first, as Gayatri has spoken very beautifully in the presentation, that up to about 20 weeks, the baby is not able to make its own thyroid hormone. So in this time, the baby is dependent on the mother for the supply of thyroid hormone, as well as that the mother's, there are a lot of changes in the blood in the thyroid hormone physiology, and that's why in the first 3 to 4 months of pregnancy, the dose of the thyroid medicine usually increases by about 30%. So a very simple rule is that if somebody is taking suppose 50 micrograms 7 days a week, you need to take 2 extra tablets per week to be supply enough thyroid hormone. So 30% of thyroid hormone medication will increase, means roughly 2 tablets a week will increase. However, once the thyroid function stabilizes by about 16 to 20 weeks, the most fluctuations are in the first 3 to 4 weeks, because a lot of HCG is secreted, and because of that there are a lot of changes. But once about 16 to 20 weeks of pregnancy is over, there is not really much change in the dose of the thyroid hormone. So if at all, as Gayatri already said, that's why we do monitoring more frequently in the first 3 to 4 weeks, and then after that we reduce the frequency of testing, because we don't expect any major fluctuations in the thyroid testing, and that's why not much change in the dose as well.
Would
The
this be
second part of the
relevant,
question,
sorry to interrupt you, would this be relevant for
Please,
someone who already has thyroid disease, or would it be also relevant for someone who has been diagnosed with thyroid for the first time during pregnancy?
Right, so that's a good question. So those who already had a thyroid problem before pregnancy, the dose increases 30%. But yes, if you initiate new thyroid hormone therapy during pregnancy, then the per kg body weight dose is much higher. So as Gayatri had specified in the presentation, about 1.6 to 1.8 microgram per kg body weight is what we use for non-pregnant people. In pregnancy, about 2.2 microgram per kg body weight would be the dose. So yes, even in patients who are de novo being started thyroid hormone medications during pregnancy, in the first 3 to 4 months, you would require more dosages compared to normal non-pregnant women. But as the pregnancy progresses, we don't usually see a very large change from 4th, 5th month onwards up to the 9th month.
Okay.
Can I just go on to the next part? Is that if you miss a thyroid tablet, what can you do? So the thing is that the half-life of the medication that we take is about 7 days. So even if you do miss a dose in a particular day, what the common mistake that people make is then they take it after breakfast, because after the breakfast they remember that, oh, I forgot my medicine. So the only thing they need to do is take double the dose the next day. So suppose I miss my tablet on Friday morning, then I don't take it after breakfast that day, but on Saturday morning, whatever is my dose, I take 2 tablets of the same, and that usually manages to iron out the skipping of the dose, and it's not a major issue. The third question, Shubhra, which you had was that whether there's any major impact of thyroid hormones on lactation, either hypo or hyperthyroidism. We don't usually see any major impact with thyroid dysfunction on lactation, at least not that I'm aware of. Gayatri, do you have any comment on that? Lactation, as far as I know, we don't make any changes.
Yes, there is no major impact of thyroid disease on lactation, or the vice versa, of lactating mothers that need more dose or anything of that sort is not really there.
So the dosage would be tapered off once
Yes.
the mother has delivered the baby, right? That the
Not
doctor
always.
Not always.
No.
Okay. Okay. Not always. All right.
So
So the
depending
doctor
upon what is the, just a very brief example is, if the starting TSH during pregnancy was very high, say it was 30 or 40, then in those women, we're not going to stop the medication after the delivery. Only in those women who had a very mild elevation of TSH, subclinical hypothyroid range, maybe during the pregnancy, then maybe 6 to 8 weeks postpartum, we'd get a check done. And if the reports are normal, the dose is very small, then we may consider stopping. But in those who already had thyroid prior to pregnancy, or in pregnancy had quite overt hypothyroidism, usually we will not stop the medicine.
Okay. Anagha, you
Yes. Yeah. So my question is for Neeti ma'am. The question is, how does one decide calorie requirement in patients with hypothyroidism? And is calorie restriction always recommended?
Right. So basically, once the hypothyroidism is corrected by thyroid replacement therapy, then the requirements, the calorie restriction is the same as it would be for any other person. So this is the whole thing. Once your thyroid function is corrected by thyroid replacement therapy, you are on the same plane as anybody else who's trying to lose weight. So that is, I think, the most important thing, because otherwise most people use hypothyroidism as a best excuse for not being able to lose weight, or not wanting to put that effort to lose weight. And this excuse just continues. And the second question was, you said caloric restriction in terms of, Anagha?
Yeah. So do we really even need calorie restriction every time for patients with hypothyroidism?
Yes. So the unfortunate part of it is that once you are on thyroid replacement therapy, it is not necessary that the weight will just melt away. you will have to still work to lose that weight. So once your thyroid function is normal, there will have to be caloric restriction in place. There will have to be increase in physical activity. The person will have to work towards weight loss. It will not just melt away.
Yeah. So one
Also,
of our
sorry
audience
to
member,
interrupt.
sorry.
Yeah, just one thing. So also it may be a possibility that there may be also a patient with hypothyroidism may be having a near normal BMI or maybe little towards the overweight side. So not necessary for all the patients who are diagnosed with hypothyroidism will need a calorie restriction. So it will also depend on what they're eating presently, what is their assessed intake. So all that also factors will take into consideration, right? I mean,
absolutely. If weight loss is not one of the weight gain is not one of the big symptoms of hypothyroidism, or it was not weight gain diagnosis, and there were other symptoms, and if the person is a normal BMI or little over BMI, then obviously there will not be severe caloric restriction. But for whatever weight gain there is, the caloric restriction will come into place. And if the weight is normal and it's just that the person was tired, fatigue, constipation, if there are other symptoms for which she was diagnosed to be hypothyroid, of course she can continue to have the balance between the caloric intake and the caloric expenditure. So it is not that once you're hypothyroid, your metabolism is sluggish for life. And
right.
therefore, so once it is corrected, you have no excuse.
Yeah, I think Neeti ma'am has also covered this extensively in her YouTube video as well. For those of you who have joined us, have just found out about this series, have not seen the video, please go through the part 1 and part 2 of our Nutribulletin series. A lot of these questions that I'm getting on the chat are already been covered in the talk by our panelist.
She also writes regular column.
Yeah, ma'am also writes a regular column as well in newspapers. You're right. So in addition to the hypothyroid, there's a question on what are the nutritional considerations of hyperthyroidism? How is it different from managing hypothyroidism? Since we're already on the topic of calorie restriction and managing hypothyroid, is hyperthyroidism any different in terms of the way you would manage, or would it be similar?
Right. So, of course, you will all agree that, we see a lot more hypothyroidism in practice than we see hyperthyroidism. But hyperthyroidism obviously means overactive thyroid. So one of the big issues there would be to cut down on the iodine intake. So if your patient is taking iodized salt, maybe he or she needs to move to non-iodized salt. If they're taking herbal supplements, they need to be away. If they are taking a lot of sea kelp, algal supplements, because they think that it was good for their thyroid, which in fact perhaps has led to hyperthyroidism, those need to be cut out. And if they are eating a lot of processed foods, a lot of breads have stabilizer in terms of iodate. So if they're eating a lot of breads, then that needs to be cut out. Red color needs to be away, because red color, the food color, has a lot of iodine there. So yes, dairy, again, if they're overdoing dairy, that will have to be kind of reduced. But generally the medication does the job, and we get the numbers corrected in few months. So it is not something that one has to forever.
In this connection, Dr. Tejal and Dr.
Neeti ma'am, what about giving extra caloric support? Yeah.
Hello. Yes.
Neeti ma'am, what about giving extra caloric support to hyperthyroid patients? Would that be necessary? Hello?
Yes, so if there has been a weight loss, which kind of generally you would see, if it hasn't been picked up or corrected for a while, then of course there will have to be extra calories given to prevent any further weight gain till the medication kind of starts working in and the thyroid function comes back to kind of normal. But that, again, that extra caloric support is short term, because again, if you continue to eat the extra calories, you will be swaying the other way. There will be rapid weight gain.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because there's a question that one of those audience members has asked. People often keep shifting from hypo to hyper. How do we manage them? Dr. Gayatri, Dr. Tejal, do you have any comments on that? do people keep shifting really if that's a phenomenon? If yes, how do you manage this condition?
Gayatri can take it. Gayatri, please go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So shifting from hypo to hyper. So there are 2-3 points here. One is if the patient who has hypothyroidism is on levothyroxine supplements, is being overdosed. If the supplements are more than the requirement of the patient, the resultant report will also show low TSH and maybe high T4 levels. So that is first or the most common situation. Second situation is in a patient with thyroiditis or recovering thyroiditis, there is initially thyrotoxicosis followed by hypothyroidism. Okay, this is because as I have explained in the video, in the earlier presentation, that there is destruction of the thyroid tissue, the hormones which are stored come out, and the blood levels are transiently high. Then subsequently it settles down, and if, during that process of inflammation, if it has damaged the thyroid tissue, the patient again goes into hypothyroidism. So that is another situation of fluctuation or flip-flop from hypo to, hyper to hypo. Third situation, which is very rare, is because we know that Graves' disease and autoimmune hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's thyroiditis, both are autoimmune in nature. So there can be some imbalance in the antibodies, and a patient with Graves' disease who has stimulating antibodies to thyroid receptor has a situation may be there rarely that a patient with Graves has recovered of Graves, but after few years goes into hypothyroidism because of the thyroid, because of the blocking kind of antibodies or different kind of antibodies. So this mixture can be rarely seen.
But
The
Gayatri,
commonest,
Gayatri, for practical purposes, the most common cause of the flip-flop between hypo and hyper is levothyroxine therapy, and all it requires is dose adjustment, maybe by a qualified endocrinologist, and that should be great.
yes.
Quite endocrinologist.
Yes.
Yes. So the next question is for you, Dr. Tejal. So is dyslipidemia common in hypothyroidism? If yes, what is the mechanism? Also, are there any menstrual disturbances in patients who are uncontrolled hypothyroidism? And what is the correlation between thyroid and heart disease and diabetes? Yeah, and is it inevitable in patients with hypothyroidism?
I think we'll take the first part.
Yeah.
Too many questions.
Too many questions. Okay, so let's take first two.
Dyslipidemia.
Yeah.
So dyslipidemia. So what I want to point out is yes, patients who have very high TSH, uncontrolled hypothyroidism. So whenever we're talking about hypothyroidism, Gayatri and I, we mean to say that patients who have TSH which is more than 10 or 20. We're not talking about TSH 5, 6, 7, right? So I want to clarify that. So whenever patients with overall hypothyroidism come to us, yes, there can be slight elevation in the LDL cholesterol levels, and this is because it does go very high, and with appropriate treatment, it comes down as well. The other part is that when you have a mild thyroid problem or a well-controlled hypothyroidism, and then the LDL level is elevated. Now, in patients with mild thyroid disorders, treating the thyroid problem will reduce the LDL by just 10 or 12 points, not more than that. So what I'm trying to explain here is that very high TSH, high LDL cholesterol level, yes, correlation. If very mild TSH and very high LDL cholesterol elevation may not be because of the thyroid, and you need to treat them like just any other person and give them a statin and find out the family history and do the usual thing. The third thing is that in patient with a mild TSH elevation, if the LDL cholesterol is very high, treating the thyroid problem is not going to bring down the LDL levels to normal, and you need to treat them separately. So a small reduction of 10 to 12 points can be expected with initiation of levothyroxine treatment, but not much in patients with subclinical hypothyroidism. So dyslipidemia was the first question. Then next was menstrual disturbances. Now menstrual. Sorry, yeah.
No, I was just saying now, since we're talking about dyslipidemia, also the thing is asked, is there any correlation between thyroid and diabetes and heart disease, and is it inevitable in them?
Right. So I don't know where the myth has come about the relation between thyroid and diabetes. There is no direct correlation between thyroid and diabetes. And a lot of patients also ask me कि हमको अभी thyroid है तो diabetes भी हो जाएगा क्या? मुझे किसी ने बोला कि we'll get diabetes. A lot of patients must be asking it to you guys also. So there is no direct relation between thyroid and diabetes. The third thing about thyroid and cardiovascular disease, now the only place where cardiovascular disease plays a major role is one in decision making. That in patients who have a TSH which is borderline between 5 and 10, and if the patient has an established cardiovascular disease, has hypertension, has ischemic heart disease, has undergone an MI and things like that, then in these patients we err on the side of treatment, because there are some data which says that instituting thyroid therapy can be beneficial to these patients. But again,
Okay.
in big discussions that we've had, even in the Endocrine Society, in the international meetings, usually TSH of 7, 8 or more, that's the kind of TSH I'm talking about, not 5, 5.5 and 6. So between 5 to 10, if the patient has an established cardiovascular disease, then we would add levothyroxine therapy because it may help to a certain extent. But in large randomized control trials, giving levothyroxine therapy does not reduce the risk of CVD or does not reduce the cardiovascular events or mortality. So there is no direct relation between thyroid and diabetes. Also, there is no direct relation between an untreated thyroid leading to coronary artery disease. It would have to be very high TSH for prolonged periods of time, maybe years together they are untreated and the LDL level is very high, then yes, it may increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. But 99.9% of cardiovascular disease out there is unlikely to have a thyroid problem associated with it.
Okay.
So again, look at the TSH, look at the individual patient, look at the individual lipid profile, what's the family history, and if the TSH is between 5 and 10, and if there is a quandary or whether you want to treat or not, then in these patients, you may err on the side of treatment. But otherwise, no direct relation between thyroid and CVD. Gayatri, you wanted to say something?
No, as you have rightly mentioned, it's only untreated patients and who have had fluctuations or high TSH for a long time are more predisposed.
Right.
Dr. Tejal, what I wanted to ask is that suppose if somebody has got a mild hypothyroidism but an elevated LDL, then would you give first opportunity for lifestyle modification or you would move to statin? What would you do?
So if it's a woman who's completed her family life and is not planning pregnancy, then lifestyle modification all the way.
Okay. Okay.
Definitely. And also that what I also want to emphasize, Anaga, is that what we do is we always talk about LDL levels and we're very hung up on LDL levels. But the thing is, ultimately, it's risk prediction which is most important. So there are a lot of calculators available online, which I'm using in my practice and other people are also, where the LDL cholesterol in context of the family history, the height, the weight, whether they're smokers. So what I'm trying to say is, let's not get stuck on thyroid and cholesterol. There is so many other factors around it which are modifiable and which can impact the LDL cholesterol levels. Thyroid is just a very small part of it.
Okay. And then the menstrual disturbances.
Menstrual disturbance. So yeah, menstrual disturbances are very common in patients with thyroid disorders, both hypothyroidism as well as hyperthyroidism. And in patients with hypothyroidism, you could have the entire gamut of changes. It could range from oligomenorrhea, amenorrhea, and very rarely to menorrhagia as well. On the other hand, in hyperthyroidism, again, menstrual disturbances are quite common, both menorrhagia, a lot of times intermenstrual bleeding, and even very rarely amenorrhea and oligomenorrhea can also be there in patients with hyperthyroidism. What I wanted to emphasize here is that most of these are reversible problems, and with the treatment of the thyroid problem, most of these resolve. But again, a point to make that in patients with very mild elevations of TSH, say 5 or 6 or 7, these usually do not cause very severe menorrhagia or very severe amenorrhea or oligomenorrhea. So again, what happens is in patients with overt hypothyroidism, very high TSH, 30, 40, 50, yes, we will see the entire range of menstrual disturbances, which can be completely different for individual person. But mild elevations of TSH, let's not get stuck on that TSH level, and we need to evaluate for other causes. I'll give you the most common example is, very women in their 40s, late 40s, they're having perimenopausal bleeding. Now that is because their menopause changes have started. And then some bright spark will do the TSH and the TSH will be 5. And they will be told that this TSH 5 or 6 is responsible for your menstrual problems. You take thyroid medicine, everything will be fine. But unfortunately, that is not the case. And giving thyroid medicine is not the answer. Whenever we initiate thyroid therapy, Dr. Anaga, we think very carefully because this is a medicine which has to be taken lifetime. So it's not a decision which can be taken lightly. And I strongly urge patients to always wait and watch. And as far as possible, if lifestyle modifications and just, taking care of other things can normalize the problem, then we are good. I think that covers everything: the menstrual disturbances, diabetes, CVD, and dyslipidemia.
Yes, very much. Thanks.
I think we'll move on to a very topic of the hour actually, superfoods. A lot of these patients come to you and say that, okay, give me a superfood that will help me cure, thyroid for good. So this question is for Neeti ma'am. What is the role of superfoods in thyroid management? Superfoods that one of our audience members mentioned is virgin coconut oil, dhania seeds, blueberries, turmeric. So is it really a like magical food that can help you control or improve your thyroid condition? And if yes, then what is the dosage that you would give these foods to a patient?
Right. So, unfortunately, there are no superfoods for thyroid health. In fact, as I mentioned, a lot of people Google and take the iodine kind of rich foods. They start taking sea kelp supplements. They will take algal supplements because they have iodine. So, unless your hypothyroidism is because of iodine deficiency, it may help, but still these supplements have extremely high doses of iodine. So in most cases, it does more harm than good. There is some evidence for the Indian herbs ashwagandha and gugul for thyroid health. Even the dosage has been kind of prescribed, but I would kind of still wait for validation for use of these herbs. More importantly, I think what we need to look at is that it's thyroid is equivalent to iodine. Once we've taken care of iodine, whether the person is using sendha namak or has been using the rock salt or the mineral salt, which is kind of, in fact, I had somebody this morning, she has been using sendha namak and then she's been using uh, the rock salt. So it's been 4 to 5 years that she's not been using iodized salt. And now she says that the weight is not moving down. She has puffiness. There's a lot of water retention. So maybe that is where we may want to get a thyroid function test done. So what I'm saying is we need to look at the iodine intake. We need to look at the selenium intake. We need to look at even the iron intake, which is so very important in the Indian population, because if the hemoglobin is low, if the iron intake is poor, then also the thyroid function is affected. Vitamin D again needs to be at an optimum level. There is also a suggestion that it is kind of an inflammatory condition, so anti-inflammatory diet, so-called, where you include turmeric and anti-inflammatory foods may help. All in all, an anti-inflammatory diet is always good for the system. It will not do you any harm in that sense, but be very careful with this mega supplements of iodine in terms of sea kelp and algal supplements.
I think you've covered this
So
topic also extensively in your the part 2 of our talk as well. But still, there are a lot of people asking this question, and I wish to therefore take it. So, like you said, there needs to be a holistic approach. You need to look at different nutrients, and often when dietitians see patients with thyroid, they only focus on goitrogenic foods. So, this is a question that a lot of our audience members have asked. Should you completely stop goitrogenic foods, and if not, then what do you do? Should you really give them? Is it okay to give it in some amounts? That's what our audience members are asking. You've covered it extensively, so I would also request all the audience members to go back to the YouTube and see the video. But if you could just briefly tell us again.
Yes, so it's a very good question, and this is something we face all the time in practice. In fact, that is the first they've Googled it and they'll say, "Oh, I'm not supposed to have cabbage and cauliflower." But when we ask them to not have the dessert or sweets to lose weight, there the compliance is poor. But the compliance is 100% when they don't have to have these vegetables. So that is what we constantly see. So what is important is that, again, goitrogenic foods are a big problem if the diet is deficient in iodine and selenium. But if the iodine and selenium intake is fine, the goitrogenic food intake is not such a big issue at all. And if you cook them, then you are further destroying the goitrogens. So cooked goitrogenic foods in a person whose iodine and selenium intake is fine is not contraindicated. Those foods can be included. Of course, if somebody wants to have a cabbage soup every day, or huge portion of cabbage as salad, you may refrain from that, but they do not need to banish these foods from their diet completely. because there are a lot of times people eat anyway 5 vegetables. Their selection of foods is vegetable is so limited, and then they knock off. They are very happy to knock off 2 more. So the vegetable intake, which is important for everything, goes down, okay, and it is replaced by again some poor carbs and poor food choices.
Right.
Okay, so the next question is for Dr. Gayatri. The question is, do all people with or patients with subclinical hypothyroidism eventually become overt hypothyroid patients? Okay, one more is, are patients with autoimmune disorder at risk of having systemic autoimmune disorders? And what is the risk of anemia in patients with hypothyroid?
Okay. So let's take it one by one. So about people who have subclinical hypothyroidism. So around 6 to 8% of them progress to overt hypothyroidism every year. And this progression depends on many factors. The most significant factors are female gender. So female patients are more likely to progress from subclinical to overt hypothyroidism. Other factors important are family history, presence of anti-TPO antibodies in them, and also TSH, which was so from subclinical, as by definition is TSH less than 10. Okay, so you can say grossly that more than 5 and less than 10. So more the TSH in this window, more likely they are to progress to overt hypothyroidism. So someone with TSH more than 6 or more than 8 in some studies, they have found that these patients are more likely to progress to overt hypothyroidism. And but very important fact is also that around 40% of patients with subclinical hypothyroidism can go back to euthyroidism
Okay.
within few months. So once subclinical doesn't mean that they will always progress to overt. So one has to monitor and one has to be careful. Okay. Second part of the question, that whether they are predisposed to systemic autoimmune disorders.
Yeah.
So per se, we have discussed about thyroid autoantibodies, the anti-TPO and the anti-thyroglobulin antibodies. These are very specific antibodies, so they only affect the thyroid gland. These antibodies by themselves are incapable of affecting other parts of the body. But as autoimmune disorders are often clustered together, this is autoimmune tendency. So such patients can have other autoimmune disorders along with it. The common disorders which are seen in patients with autoimmune hypothyroidism are vitiligo, alopecia areata, atrophic gastritis, pernicious anemia, which is because of antibodies to, autoimmune vitamin B12 deficiency. So vitamin B12 deficiency can be there in such patients. Celiac disease, and rarely type 1 diabetes, which is also an autoimmune disorder, can also have autoimmune hypothyroidism. And coming to anemia in hypothyroidism, that is the third part, right? So uncontrolled primary or overt hypothyroidism itself can be associated with a degree of anemia, in which the anemia is normocytic normochromic, meaning the red blood cell size and the hemoglobin content in the cell is normal, but still there is anemia. It is because of overall reduction in the metabolism and reduction in the oxygen requirements and reduction in the erythropoietin. Second part is iron deficiency anemia. So by law of commonality, it is the commonest kind of anemia that you see, nutritional. So even patients with hypothyroidism can also have. Other part is, as I discussed, that autoimmune hypothyroidism can be associated with autoimmune atrophic gastritis. So antibodies to the acid producing cells in the stomach can also be there in about 30% of the patients. So because of this, the stomach acid secretion is reduced. So because of that, many nutrient absorption from the gut is reduced. One of them is iron. So that's how iron deficiency can be connected. Third part about iron deficiency is patients with menorrhagia. As Dr. Tejal has discussed, menorrhagia with hypothyroidism can obviously have iron deficiency. And fourth part is around 12 to 15% of the patients with primary hypothyroidism also have the megaloblastic anemia, or the pernicious anemia that we call. So these antibodies prevent vitamin B12 absorption, and then they can have B12 deficiency anemia. So these are all the causes of anemia in a patient with hypothyroidism.
Yeah.
So I think
I had one question here for Dr. Gayatri, if you permit, Anagha and Sukhada.
yes, ma'am.
Uh,
Sure, ma'am.
So, there are a lot of patients with subclinical hypothyroidism. There, does it make sense to get the antibodies tested, and does that add any value to the decision making?
Yes. So in patients with subclinical hypothyroidism, basically, as we said, that 40% of them can go back to euthyroidism. So we must decide whether we want to start levothyroxine and why we want to start, because these patients are unlikely to have any specific symptoms. So in situations like pregnancy, in situations where patients are very old, more than 70 years, subclinical, it becomes important to decide whether you want to start and whether you want to continue. So if patient with subclinical has positive antibodies, it makes more sense to start with levothyroxine, because today or tomorrow they might progress to overt hypothyroidism.
But
Right,
Niti,
because
what I
we
also
see,
want to just say is that I think the thyroid antibodies create more confusion rather than offer any clarity most of the time. Because what happens, it's a mild TSH of 5.5 and the antibody is 1000. Now the patient completely forgets about the TSH and now is completely focused on that value of 1000, and we'll see at least 20 different doctors trying to figure out what to do with that antibody test. So as endocrinologists, we're very afraid of antibody tests, and a lot of times the patient will pay the full consultation fee, wait outside for 2 hours, and finally there's nothing you need to do because it's just an antibody report. So just to emphasize that the TSH has to be taken into consideration with the entire clinical context of the patient, the pregnancy plan, the fertility issues, and everything taken into context. Only then we decide. So antibody would help, but would not be the only thing that would decide whether we want to treat or not.
right, because we see this again very commonly. They have people, they have tried to lose weight, the weight is not moving, they are frustrated. They come out with this mildly elevated thyroid TSH, where the doctors are asking them to now wait and watch, come back after 2-3 months, repeat the test. They are very impatient.
Yes.
So that is a typical picture where I thought whether these, if you get the antibodies done and then they do come out on the higher side, then should that help in decision making? But yes, you made it very clear. Yeah.
And I also explain patients that the easiest thing for me is to start a thyroid hormone therapy for you. It's the easiest thing for me. I don't have to waste my time. I don't have to explain anything to you. मैं गोली लिख के आपको भेज दूंगी. But if the goal for which you have come, which is weight loss, if it is not achieved by starting the thyroid medication, then what is the point? So once that context is explained to them that the goal that they're looking for will not be achieved by 12.5 or 25 microgram, but will be an additional pill burden, will be an additional financial burden. You have to monitor, you have to go to the doctor, you have to do the test. So it's not as simple as it looks. So I think with proper explanation, we are able to explain, but I agree that mostly everybody wants a quick fix and everybody wants something to blame, which is easy and convenient. And I think we should just be kind to people because, yeah, it's human nature, right?
Absolutely.
yeah. So I think that it's really important that the reason why we have this panel today is we want doctors and dietitians to work together in managing the thyroid, and that multidisciplinary approach is absolutely essential, which I think all three of you have pointed out in your videos as well. So the next question is actually for all of you, and there is a lot of this. It's probably a myth. People are saying that iodine excess can lead to hypothyroidism and autoimmune thyroiditis, and it's a scam that our salt is iodized. How true is that? Especially for susceptible populations who have recurring thyroid disease, apparently, and a lot of Chinese publications are there in this regard as well. So, what is your view on that?
Gayatri, you want to take it? And Niti, ma'am?
Ma'am, you can start with it.
Okay, so basically the history is that we had a lot of iodine deficiency in our country, and iodine deficiency can cause profound mental retardation, can cause very large goiters and hypothyroidism. So iodine supplementation or iodized salt was a boon for our country, which has really got us out of that entire mental retardation, iodine deficiency, goiters and all of that. And now when you go to Northeast India, you don't really see any goiters. So this was actually called the goiter belt, that whole Himalayan range in the Northeast. So I think iodine at any point was never a scam. and it is very incorrect to call it that. Iodized salt was made mandatory because to ensure that each and every person living in our country gets access to iodine, right, which was not possible, and poorer people will not be able to buy expensive iodine supplements and everything, and that is why iodized salt was very, very important. Yes, there is some data which does say that exposure to excess iodine can precipitate the generation of thyroid autoantibodies, because there's some disruption of the thyroid follicular membrane, and antigens are exposed. So yes, exposure to iodine can cause an increase in autoimmune thyroid disease, but with everything in medicine there will be some pros and cons of everything, so it can't be said that it was a scam. But yes, excess iodine intake should be avoided. So, and when Neeti was also talking about, the people taking iodine supplements and all of that. For us, one of the major issues is when people have lots of CT scans, they have huge iodine excesses, even in CT scans, which are done for no apparent reason. So in patients who have an underlying thyroid problem, if they're exposed to a large quantity of iodine, like in a CT scan when the iodinated contrast is given, or in supplements with very high iodine, then yes, in those cases with already having an underlying thyroid problem in place, hyperthyroidism can result. So we do see patients in clinical practice who have an underlying thyroid abnormality exposed to large quantity of iodine and ending up with hyperthyroidism. So it works both ways, that exposure to iodine can cause autoimmune antibody generation, and can cause hypothyroidism as well. And large quantities of iodine in patients with underlying thyroid disease can precipitate hyperthyroidism. But this is the minority of people. And for the general public, even actually Neeti said in hyperthyroidism, we ask them sometimes to stop iodized salt. Very honestly, as endocrinologists, we don't even ask that, because we have excellent medications like carbimazole, which are very good at controlling hyperthyroidism. And with the normal dietary iodine, we are not really concerned at all about the iodine intake. So when patients ask us, what is the dietary management you want for hyperthyroidism, we never tell them take less iodine or don't take iodized salt. Unless they're going for an iodine scan or they're going for iodine treatment, then in those cases, for a small period of time, we ask them to take an iodine, sparse diet to just improve the iodine therapy.
Yeah.
So by and large, practicing endocrinologists, yeah, Gayatri, please go ahead.
Yeah, so iodine-free diet only when it is recommended in certain situations like thyroid cancer. I mean, when they want to undergo scans and all, only in such situations we ask them to avoid iodized salt, or they can
So by
roast
and
that.
large, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
So by and large, what you're trying to say is iodization of the salt was absolutely essential. It's one of the most successful public health initiatives that are done by the National Institute of Nutrition, ICMR, and AIIMS Hospital, Dr. C.S. Pandav and the team. So it's absolutely essential that all of us consume salt that is iodized. And again, rightly pointed out by Neeti ma'am in her talk as well, that using Sendha Namak or Himalayan salt, we need to be really careful not to go in for the marketing gimmicks by some of these salt companies. Would you like to add anything, Neeti ma'am, to this?
No, so exactly. Basically, the soil in the entire Indian subcontinent is iron deficient. So it's a population-based strategy, and the benefits far outweigh the little risk that Dr. Tejal mentioned. So, and in fact, it's one of our most successful public health strategies, where almost 75%, 3 out of 4 households have now access to, are in fact meeting the requirements for iodized salt. And 90%, there's 90% penetration of use of iodized salt. There are certain states which, like Tamil Nadu or Orissa, where the penetration, Karnataka, where the penetration is poor. So in fact, dietitians who are practicing in those states may need to in fact look at the iodine intake more closely. But yes, we cannot say there cannot be a blanket statement that this whole entire thing is a scam. As Sukhada said, it has been used as a marketing gimmick by a few companies.
Right. And Subhda, just one last comment is that, in women who are from lower socioeconomic strata, iodine is a very vital nutrient for brain development. So especially in patients like this who are so vulnerable, so if a few, I think upper economic people suffer a little autoimmune hypothyroidism, what I loved what Neeti ma'am said, that the benefits far, far outweigh the risk. That is what we would like to end this with.
Yes. So I think before we take the case study, Anagha, you had one question.
Yeah, just one last question. Many times hypothyroid patients are also advised calcium supplementation. So is there any reason for that?
So Gayatri and I laughed about this because, when you're practicing, when you're training as an endocrinologist and you're seeing about 100, 200 patients a day, you don't even really think what you're writing, and whatever has been written by your seniors for the past few years, you just continue the same thing. So that's what we both were discussing yesterday and laughing about. And yeah, I don't endorse, calcium supplementation for everybody. We have lots of good dairy rich food which you can eat and, meet your calcium needs. So unless it's a postmenopausal woman who is at risk for osteoporosis, or transiently in somebody with very severe thyrotoxicosis, where I'm afraid that there's going to be a lot of, calcium excretion into the urine, and in those cases, maybe I would supplement calcium. But if the diet is pretty decent, then I would usually not force people to take calcium supplements at all. Vitamin D is a different scenario, where vitamin D, because we can't compensate with diet, and most of our population is vitamin D deficient. So vitamin D I do endorse, but this would be for anybody. But I don't prescribe, and we don't want to prescribe calcium per force for everybody.
Okay.
Yeah,
And there's one last, oh yeah, sorry, ma'am, go
a
on.
small note there again. In fact, again, we see patients who are taking thyroid replacement therapy. They will pop in their calcium supplement, levothyroxine, everything in the morning, like a bouquet of tablets, everything is taken together. So you are, in fact, it's a counterproductive step. You're not supposed to be taking anything with your levothyroxine. So you think you're doing yourself good by taking a calcium supplement, but now the thyroxine also doesn't work well. So I think that is something we, again, as dietitians, very often doctors, don't have time, patients Google it, and they don't want to, they are not very clear. So I always spend time asking them that when are you taking your levothyroxine? And they will come up with various answers. Oh, I take with my first cup of tea. Oh, I forget, so I take it with all my medicines. And then there are others who, who wake up at 4:30 to go to the restroom, or they go wake up for their prayers. They have it, they go back to sleep, so that then they don't have to wait for their cup of tea as soon as they get up. So I think there are various strategies, but we need to make sure that it is taken the right way, the right timing, and that not with any other supplements.
So I think in this connection, ma'am, you've shared some good tips on the YouTube video as well. So I would request all to go back and see the talk. Those of you who haven't already done so. Yeah, so I think we will head to the case study, because there are some case study related questions also, and they're going to cover the questions that we have from the audience. So if you can just share my screen with you. Is this visible? Yeah. So we have this case study that was shared by one of our audience members with us. It's a case of a 40-year-old male. He's currently weighing 106 kilos and has a BMI of 38 kg per meter square. He put on 16 kilos in 10 years ago, and that is when he was first detected with hypothyroidism. His weight keeps fluctuating, and he put on additional 13 kilos in the last 10 years to reach 106 kilos. So he started at around 75, 77, and today his weight is 106 in 10 years' time. He has an extremely sedentary lifestyle, not able to exercise because he feels very fatigued, restless. And the thyroxine dosage was upped from 50 to 120 milligrams. The TSH in the last 3 reports was normal. There's no other comorbidity. He does not have diabetes, blood pressure, no other issues. Occasionally he drinks and does not smoke as well. Is this like a classic case that some of you might see in your practice? These are the questions that our audience member had. Is hypothyroid responsible for weight gain? I did lose some weight, but then hit a plateau. Now I find it difficult to lose weight any further. Often, a lot of the patients that come to us with thyroid, they say that, okay, because of thyroid, I'm not able to lose weight. I lost 5 kilos, but now I've hit a plateau and there's nothing I can do to lose weight. So one by one, if our panel members could take this question, and is it really true that you would hit a plateau with thyroid, hypothyroid? Dr. Tejav, can we start with you?
Okay, so I'm going to say something which is actually completely, it may seem, not a response to the question, but because we're all nutritionists here and we're endocrinologists and we all see patients with obesity. So if you can hear what we're talking time and again, we're talking about obesity and thyroid, obesity and thyroid. Now, the reason this is happening is because patients with obesity are tired, they're frustrated, they're disappointed, you know, they're so tired of their weight that they're reaching out for straws and, you know, trying to find a reason to explain the weight gain. What most of the time as nutritionists and endocrinologists, we also fail to acknowledge is that obesity is a disease just like anything else. And obesity is very poorly understood. So whenever we meet somebody like this, I think the first thing that we need to remember is to speak with kindness and compassion. You know, we tend to be very blunt, nahi nahi ye thyroid ki wajah se nahi hai, you know. So when you say that, what happens is the reason the doctor, he changes the doctor or he changes the nutritionist is because what the base question that he had of what to do with his weight has not been answered. And that is why these are people who are tired, who are frustrated, are disappointed and depressed about their obesity, and that's why they're going from pillar to post. So yes, I know that a mild thyroid elevation is not responsible for this much of weight gain. His BMI is 38 kg per meter square, right at the outset, and he's continuing to gain weight. And we all know that obesity is a vicious cycle where you gain weight, you develop knee osteoarthritis, you can't exercise, and you gain more weight. Also, it's extremely difficult to lose and maintain weight loss. But what we need to separate for the patient is that the thyroid is something which is separate, and obesity per se is a disease where it is extremely easy to gain weight, very difficult to lose weight, and our body basically has something which is called as a weight set point, and it tries to remain as close to that weight set point as possible. So minute somebody does diet, exercise and starts to lose weight, the body tries its level best to go back to the weight that you started with. So from the onset, if we could talk to patients saying that obesity per se, especially in this case whose BMI is 38 kg per meter square, we recognize that nobody wants to be obese. People are not overweight because they're lazy or they don't do their diet or they don't exercise, because we have lots of patients who do everything and still don't manage to lose weight. Giving them tools to, maybe in this person, I would definitely talk about bariatric surgery. I would tell them of how if you lose the weight, the thyroid problem also will improve. And as Gayatri spoke, there's actually studies out there where post-bariatric surgery, people's thyroid medications have come down about 50-75%. And people who are on small doses of thyroid medicine have actually been able to get rid of their thyroid because the need for the thyroid hormone is so much lesser with the weight loss. So one is pointing out, speaking with kindness and compassion, acknowledging what their struggles are and not being rude or sarcastic. And I'm not saying this to anybody else. I have done this myself so many times. It's a busy OPD. And you know that Google search ka wo pura gyan tumko dete, so we get defensive and we get angry and we don't address the problem properly. So whenever a patient like this comes, we take a pause. Be kind, be compassionate, acknowledge what their struggles are, tell them that you understand that it's almost impossible to lose weight for them. Even if they lose, they regain very easily, and how difficult it is for them. Explaining that obesity is a disease where thyroid has a very small part to play. In this particular patient, his TSH has been normal for almost the last 3 reports and is almost 100% not responsible for the plateau that he has hit. And as in any other obese patient, you need to intensify the exercise efforts or intensify the diet modifications to have further weight loss. In this person, I don't expect the diet exercise is going to help him to lose his weight completely. And definitely a bariatric surgery would be a very valid option for this person. This is what I think. And of course, Gayatri and Neeti ma'am can have some other opinion about it as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tejal. I think, like you rightly pointed out, it's important to look at what the patient is trying to tell you. Not just look at the BMI, you need to look at all the aspects. You know, you've mentioned his sedentary weight. He knows that you're going to talk about his alcohol and smoking. So he's pointed that out also. Oh, that I don't do. So it's definitely the thyroid that's making you lose weight. So look beyond what the patient is trying to tell you. Dr. Gayatri, Neeti ma'am, do you have anything to add to this?
Yes, so as Dr. Tejal mentioned, it's very important the way we talk to the patients and the communication, the exact terms that we use are very, very important because they make an impact on their behavior. So I always tell them that obesity, as Dr. Tejal said, these are two different things, and with patients who are totally uncontrolled where the TSH is very, very high, it leads to as much as 5 kgs or maximum 10% of the body weight. I mean the weight gain because of thyroid per se is only 10%. And once they start with the levothyroxine treatment, they are likely to reduce that much only, not beyond that. So anything beyond that is not really related to your thyroid. So you will have to do efforts to lose this. So probably we can help you in that. And because of obesity, and there are many other problems that the patients have, so that pill burden is often high. So adding levothyroxine to it, and often they think that levothyroxine once started is often lifelong. It's another myth that we had discussed. So in such patients, if their efforts and if they stay positive and they really lose a significant amount of weight, we can reduce and we can stop your levothyroxine. So that can act as a additional inspirational point for them. So I always make it sure that I have explained this to the patients.
Okay, so the third one is, does
Neeti
stress
ma'am,
or
I think has something to say. Another?
Yeah, so I think I would definitely look at the caloric intake in terms of it would be perhaps that just needs to be modified. The activity level may be limited because of the challenges, but we haven't talked about of the caloric intake or his dietary habits. So even if we just alter that, that might help. Also, secondly, this high BMI. In fact, I always tell them that as good news, higher the BMI, the faster, or you have more chances that there would be some weight loss of 5 to 10%. If we are looking at a BMI of 24 and wanting to be 22, that's a bigger challenge than going from 38 to 36. So that's the positive or silver lining to it, and that's how we kind of try and convince the patients. Of course, if we probe into it and there is a huge family history, obesity runs in the family, then of course we would look at finally considering bariatric surgery. But caloric restriction in the right way would still be given a chance here.
A quick yes and no question on this note that Neeti ma'am has mentioned this. Does thyroid run in the family as well? Hello? Yeah. Does thyroid run in the family as well?
Yes, so autoimmune hypothyroidism is commonly seen in family members because the predisposition, the same kind of genetic makeup predisposes these individuals in the same family to develop the autoimmune antibodies which act against the thyroid. And yes, autoimmune hypothyroidism does run. So we ask for anti-DPO antibodies if the patient has family history of hypothyroidism or any other thyroid dysfunction.
Yeah. Another?
also for Neeti ma'am, I would like to know, the question has been asked is, how do I increase my metabolism? Are there any dietary foods or any measures that by which you can increase your metabolism?
Yes, the metabolic rate could be increased irrespective of even having hypothyroidism. So, the most sensible and kind of scientifically known methods which most dietitians or nutritionists know is that of course you need to start exercising. Physical activity increases BMR. Small and frequent meals is known to increase BMR, but now there's a whole controversy with intermittent fasting about this one. Physical activity, small and frequent meals, sleep pattern, extremely important for maintaining your BMR, drinking enough, having sufficient fluid intake. So unfortunately, these are very simple steps which a lot of time are not very convincing for the patients. They want those miracle magic bullets which will increase their metabolic rate and the weight kind of just melts away. So of course there are certain foods, so-called functional foods, where there are some studies which are showing that they do help increase your metabolic rate, or they increase your fat burn in the kind of local colloquial terms. But I think that would be for another discussion.
So based on the case study, I would like to ask Dr. Tejal, now since this patient seems to be under immense stress or worries about his weight or preoccupied with weight or depressed, so does stress or depression affect hypothyroid or vis-a-vis?
I'm trying to figure out what is the right answer to give. So because when I was at Nair, Anaga, we used to have a lot of tussles with the psychiatric department because they would send everybody with the thyroid antibody report positive and would tell us that we have studies which show that giving thyroid medicine improves depression. And see, most of them are case control cohort studies. There's no randomized control trial data which potentiates that severe stress or severe depression can affect the thyroid function. Yes, if you have very severe hypothyroidism, you may be depressed. But very honestly, in 20 years of my practice, I've never seen somebody who was screened because of only depression and no other symptom, and they were found to have a thyroid problem. So anybody who has a thyroid problem would manifest a lot of other things except just the depression. More than depression, it's a slowing of clinic activities, the slowing of the thinking, difficulty in taking decisions. Another thing is that we would love to make stress the fall guy for every disease known to mankind, including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, thyroid, and whatnot. We would love to do that. But I always ask the patient only one question, that you name one person in this world who doesn't have stress. So if at all you want to talk about the relation of stress and thyroid, the only one place where stress is proven to have a role is hyperthyroidism, where it is known that patients who undergo severe stress are more likely to develop Graves' disease and hyperthyroidism. So that's the only place where stress actually has a role, is hyperthyroidism and not hypothyroidism.
Yes, so just to make that point little further, the hyperthyroidism and stress. So this stress has to be really very severe and life-changing stress, like getting divorced or getting shifting one place to other, or death of someone who's close to you, a loved one. So something like this, if there is this history in the preceding 1 or 2 years of diagnosis of Graves, probably it is somewhere responsible for pathophysiology of Graves. But the common variety hypothyroidism and the common stress that everybody goes through is not really very strongly related.
So exam stress and breaking up, the usual things that we think of, मैं रात को सोई नहीं थी तो इसलिए, stuff like that. We don't mean stress like that. The point she's trying to make.
Right.
Yeah, I think point well taken. We try to blame everything on everyday stress. One very interesting question that this fellow wanted to ask is, should he go on a gluten-free diet or a keto diet or any specific kind of a diet? I think this is mainly for Neeti ma'am to answer. Would any diet would help him lose this weight? Or intermittent fasting for that matter?
Right, so any and every diet works till you follow it. So the important thing is the compliance. So we need to sit with him, spend time, and figure out what kind of dietary strategy is going to be more practical, doable, and something that he can carry on for a long time, not something that you can do for 1 month because you are very kind of you're very enthusiastic about it, and then it just kind of peters off. So I think that is where we need to spend time and figure out what works best for him and create a caloric deficit in that format. But the keto, intermittent fasting, again, things that we would have to kind of really sit and discuss with him and see whether it's going to be practical, because I'm not a great fan of keto diet, so it's not something I'm going to push first. Gluten-free diet, I mean, we always encourage our patients to have other grains, the millets, which has more fiber, has a higher satiety value. So if somebody wants to go on a gluten-free diet, I kind of don't discourage it till they are not obsessive about it. So instead of wheat roti, they want to have jawar and bajra roti, please go ahead, have it. So in that sense, yes, but it's not like if I don't get a wheat roti, I will not have it. A lot of people are again using this as an excuse to eat a lot of rice. Gluten doesn't suit me, so they move to rice. Then that's not a gluten-free diet that's going to work. So again, these are some of the topics, some of the points that we need to discuss with our patients.
Possibly also, ma'am, the reason gluten-free may slightly work is because we actually take out all the bakery foods, all the refined foods, So all the bakery items, everything goes out. So in a way,
Also
we
the
bring
roti.
out the trans fat, refined flour, everything goes out. So that probably can be a good compliance that I'm on gluten free, so I will not have these products. So probably that might be working for a
Absolutely.
while.
Absolutely. That's why I said go ahead. If you don't want to have a roti and bread and you want to have jawar and bajra chapatis, please go ahead. We would love it. And as you said, all the so-called fast foods, the pasta and the pizza and the of course now you're getting even other variations of pasta and pizza,
Gluten free, right?
gluten free. But on a general basis, yes, most of the bakery products, the khari and the butter and everything will just kind of go away. So yes, absolutely.
With this, I think we will. Time is already 6:45, so I'm going to kind of unfortunately have to wrap up this panel. We have a lot of questions that have come on Facebook. There are a lot of questions on the chat as well. Like I've been mentioning all throughout, some of these questions are answered on our YouTube channel. So please go and watch the part 1 and part 2 of this series. To summarize, I would say that all three speakers have pointed out that we do not look at thyroid as just one entity. Look at a holistic approach. Look at all aspects that the patient comes up with. Treat thyroid as thyroid condition, but also look at other comorbidities and keep them as required. Caloric restriction perhaps is not always the solution in these patients. Look at the iodine intake, like ma'am has mentioned. So hypothyroid patients absolutely need to ensure that they are getting their iodine from iodized salt. Look at other sources of iodine if the patient has hyperthyroid. By and large, an individualized approach is absolutely essential. So one diet, one kind of superfood is not going to fit all. Again, other comorbidities, there could be predisposition, we don't know at the moment. So connection with diabetes or CVD, as speakers have said, that there is no direct correlation, but yes, you need to look at your other risk factors as well. Regular monitoring is also absolutely essential. Do not taper your medicine on your own. Speak to your doctor, let the doctor make the decision as to when you need to test yourself and how the medication needs to be tapered as well. So thank you so much, speakers, for giving a holistic approach to thyroid management. A small announcement for all the participants. Those of you who have joined us on Zoom, we'll be sending you the feedback form by 8 p.m. today. It's going to be open for 24 hours. And there is a small quiz for you on that. If you meet 80% requirement, you will be receiving a certificate on your email ID. I now welcome Ms. Jayashree Paranspe, who is our co-convener, to give the vote of thanks, please.
Hello. It was a wonderful session. All the NAIRites out there on the panel. Dr. Tejal, Dr. Gayatri, Anada, even for that matter, Sukada is our ex-student.
Yes.
So it makes me feel very nice. It was a wonderful session, and we have started this initiative, Dr. Tejal, Nutri Bulletin. You must have heard a lot about it from this, and you have started our sessions. Thank you so much for giving us so much time out of your busy schedule. You and Dr. Gayatri, I'm sure you must have been very, very busy during all this time, but we can always, we feel it is our right to invite you.
We are very honored that you invited us and that you made us the opening batswomen. Thank you so very much. And I saw your photo in the corner and I actually wanted to shout out, hi, Jayashree ma'am, but I was controlling myself. And then Sukda said, okay, Jayashree ma'am can speak now. So I was like, good, I can say hello to her.
Yeah, so it is our pleasure anyways to always be connected. And thank you, participants. It is because of you all that these sessions were made successful. All your questions and queries, as Sukada rightly said, will be answered. You all can get back to us. Please go back. All these videos are there on YouTube channel. So anything that you have missed out, you can go back and see those videos. And we will be in touch with you. The second installment of Nutri Bulletin is going to be there right tomorrow. So stay tuned with us. Be with IDA Mumbai chapter. In upcoming weeks, there are going to be more and more interesting sessions. And that's it from our side. Sukada and Anaga, it was a wonderful initiative. And we know that you will be doing fab job even in upcoming sessions and upcoming programs. Thank you so much. Once again, Tejal and Dr. Gayatri, thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, and Neeti, sorry, because she is our very own, I forgot to take her name, but Neeti, thank you very much for being on the panel. And
Always there, always there.
Yeah, it is just that we always forget our own people, and I'm really sorry to mention you. Thank you so much.
I just
Thank you,
wanted to give one last comment
Yes,
that, you know,
please.
the way Jayashree ma'am and Anaga and all the NIRIDs, the way we would manage the NIR diabetes OPD, I still see the same. And I told this to Anaga, Jayashree ma'am, that till today my dietitian sees the patient first and then I see the patient. And 99% of the time, I don't need to do anything because she's done the job. Already everything has been streamlined, the empty calories, everything explained. And all I have to do is little bit dawai idhar upar and then I'm done. I still follow that pattern till today.
That makes us feel very nice
Yeah,
Absolutely.
about our practices.
that's a
and
very good note to end the session on.
Yes.
That the role of nutritionist endocrinologist is always complementary. One cannot do without the other.
Correct. It's a team effort at the end of the day, and that is what we wanted to highlight, that you cannot achieve the results, just a dietitian or just an endocrinologist. So it is always a team effort. And that's it from us today. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Dr. Tejal.
Thank you.
Thank